They heard whispers, whispers on walkie-talkies, read it in the eyes of tired commanders. They were told that it was impossible. Patton's soldiers were surrounded, overwhelmed by numbers and firepower, driven into a damp German forest, face to face with the elite of the elite, the SS Division Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler. Survival should have been hopeless. Just yesterday, they were marching through the mud of France, warming themselves around campfires in the Ardennes, writing letters home in the light of kerosene lamps. They were just ordinary guys mechanics from Midwestern farms, teachers from Pennsylvania, the sons of immigrants from the Hudson River. They weren't super soldiers, they were tired. And yet, in less than 18 hours, these ordinary soldiers had accomplished the unimaginable. They didn't just stand up. They dispelled in clouds of smoke and gunpowder one of the most enduring myths of the Second World War, the myth of the invincibility of the Nazi war machine, the overwhelming power of the SS divisions. The question was, how did they do it? What happens when an unstoppable force meets an insurmountable obstacle? On March 6, 1945, in the dark, dank forests of Germany, in the area of the little-known town of Stadt Kiel, this question ceased to be the subject of philosophical debate. It became a matter of blood, steel, and a simple animal survival instinct. Part 1. The Tiger on the Threshold. An opponent shrouded in myths. To truly feel the scale of the impending storm, you need to understand the nature of the enemy approaching through the forest thicket. The 1st SS Panzer Division, Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler, was not an ordinary military formation. It was not just a division, it was a symbol, a living legend of the Third Reich. Born in 1933 as the Fuhrer's personal guard, a small group of fanatically devoted fighters, by 1945 it had developed into a battle-hardened, battle-tested elite armored sledgehammer. These people were not just soldiers. They were political warriors, true believers in Nazi ideology, selected for racial purity, physical perfection, and blind devotion to Hitler. Their motto was, "My honor is called loyalty." Their battle path was written in blood and fire all over the map of Europe. In Poland, in 1939, they were at the forefront. Their actions were often shrouded in rumors of atrocities against the civilian population, laying the foundation for intimidation tactics. In France in 1940, they were the spearhead of the Blitzkrieg, crushing the Allied defenses with the same ruthless confidence that crushed armies from Warsaw to Paris. On the Eastern Front, they plunged into the darkest depths of the War of Annihilation. The battles of Dubno, Uman, Rostov, and the Cauldron near Kharkov tempered them in the crucible of unprecedented cruelty. They have learned to spare no one, neither the enemy nor themselves. In the Ardennes, just a few months earlier, they had reconfirmed their reputation. It was the Leibstandarte fighters who were involved in the Malmedy massacre, where dozens of American prisoners of war were shot. This story, whispered in the American trenches, spread not just fear, but chilling horror. To surrender to them was to sign his own death warrant. When intelligence reports in early March 1945 confirmed that the Leibstandarte was moving towards their positions, the veterans, those who had passed through the Ardennes, exchanged meaningful glances. They knew what that meant. It meant facing an enemy who killed without hesitation, who expected victory as a given, who never gave up. It was every Allied soldier's nightmare, taking on flesh and steel. Part 2. Exhausted Eagles. Patton's army is at the end of its strength. But it was no longer 1940 or even December 1944. By March 1945, the Third Reich was in agony. The Allies were biting into the very heart of Germany. General George S. Patton's Third Army, that indomitable hammer of the Allies, had swept through France, broken through the Siegfried Line in the Saarland, and was now advancing on the Rhineland. However, the rapid offensive had its price. Victories came at a high price, and that price was written all over the soldiers' haggard faces. stretched communications. Supply lines stretched for hundreds of miles. Fuel, ammunition, spare parts. Everything was delivered intermittently. The tankers saved every shell. The infantrymen saved every pack of cigarettes. Physical and mental exhaustion. These people haven't been out of combat for months. They went through the nightmare of the Hurtgen forest, froze in the Ardennes, stormed fortified cities. The fatigue wasn't just physical, it was ingrained in the bones, clouding the mind. They fought on nerves, on sheer willpower. Disparate units. The front was mobile. The units were often mixed up, creating improvised tactical groups. The positions were occupied hastily, not because of tactical advantages, but simply because it was here that the order to hold on found them. It was in this place, near the wooded hills around Stadt Kiel, that the fateful encounter was supposed to take place. The American forces defending the ridge were a hodgepodge of soldiers from the 94th Infantry Division and tankers from the 8th Armored Division. They were commanded by Captain James Morrison, an officer whose youth was hidden under a layer of dust and wrinkles of fatigue. Their defensive positions were not chosen for a long defense. The hills provided a good view, but there was little depth behind them. There were no prepared rear lines and few escape routes. It was a random point on the map, a hole that needed to be plugged while the main forces were preparing for a major offensive across the Rhine. Captain Morrison was aware of intelligence reports on the movement of German armored vehicles. But in those days, the reports came in dozens. Reality appeared in the pre-dawn fog on March the 6th with the low, guttural growl of tank engines, a sound distinctly different from the usual rumble of the Shermans. And soon he saw them. The angular silhouettes of the Panthers, the Panzer IV, and, worst of all, the frightening outlines of the Tigers II, Royal Tigers, whose frontal armor was practically impenetrable by the Sherman guns in the frontal projection. Each car had the black SS rune Leibstandarte on it. What drove the Germans into this trap? Despair. Berlin was only a few weeks away from encirclement, but the Nazi leadership clung to the faint hope that a fierce counterattack, even a local one, would be able to force the Allies to slow down their offensive and perhaps come to the negotiating table. To do this, they threw their best remaining units into battle. So Leibstandarte, the masters of armored breakthroughs, received an order to crush the thin American line, break into the rear, sow chaos and break the rhythm of Patton's offensive. Against this polished steel, the Americans could only show fortitude, discipline, and the bitter memory of Malmedy. They knew that there was nowhere to retreat to. They knew that surrender was tantamount to death. That's why, on the eve of battle, alike veterans and recruits tightened the straps of their helmets, checked the bolts of their M1 Garands, polished their grenades, and peered into the darkness of the forest, from which death was about to appear. Part 3. Dawn of Steel. First strike and chaos. Dawn on March 6, 1945, over Stotka was gray and humid. The fog crept down the hillsides, clung to the tree trunks. At first, the Americans mistook the growing rumble for distant thunder, but the sound grew stronger, clearer, and unmistakably recognizable heavy German diesel engines. An alarm wave swept through the trenches. Captain Morrison's men, many of whom were still trying to shake off the shackles of a short nap, instantly realized that this was not a reconnaissance mission, not a firefight. It was the full weight of the 1st SS Panzer Division moving right at them. Morrison's positions were scattered along the crest of the hill. Infantry squads in shallow rifle cells. Machine gun crews with M1919 Brownings covered the clearings. A platoon of Shermans had hidden behind the reverse slopes of the hills, their long 76mm cannon barrels barely visible from behind their shelters. Behind them, in prepared firing position, stood 105mm howitzers, their crews at the ready, connected to forward observers by radio. And then the first silhouettes emerged from the fog. The Panthers were elegant and deadly, with their long-barreled 75mm cannons that could blast through a Sherman from an incredible distance. Panzerwerfers were moving behind them in a tight formation, and behind them, like gigantic ghosts, towered the Royal Tigers, their massive 88mm guns inspiring primal horror. In front and between the tanks, SS Grenadiers in camouflage jackets glided through the undergrowth, covering them, their movements honed by years of war. For a moment, an eerie silence reigned in the forest, broken only by the increasing roar of engines. And then, the first shot. It was one of the Shermans that fired. The recoil rumbled through the valley. The shell hit the side of the Panther, ricocheted off the thick armor, leaving only a star of chips. The German column responded with a crushing salvo. Dozens of cannon barrels belched fire. The forest exploded. Trees were splitting in half, and the ground was heaving with fountains of mud and debris. One of the Shermans on the ridge flared up like a torch, its crew engulfed in flames, trying to get out of the hatch. The battle has begun. What followed in those first few minutes was chaos mixed with incredible resilience. The Americans should not have been able to resist. According to all the canons of military science, they should have faltered under the pressure of German armor and elite infantry. But instead of panicking, they began to adapt. The Shermans, hopelessly inferior in a one-on-one duel, turned into ghosts. They didn't stand still. They were constantly moving. They rolled out onto the ridge, fired a shot, and without waiting for an answer, rolled back, changing their position before the German gunners could catch them in their sights. They became not tanks for dueling, but mobile firing points, teasing an elusive target. And then the American artillery, the god of war, came into play. The advanced observers, huddled to the ground in their cells, with radios glued to their ears, began to call fire on themselves. Their voices, high on adrenaline but clear, carried to the artillery command posts. And a few minutes later, the sky above the German lines was torn apart by the whistling of shells. 105 mm high explosive shells rained down on German infantry and equipment concentrations, forcing tanks to disperse, disrupting attacks even before they began. When the SS infantry managed to get close, infantrymen with bazookas joined the battle. These anti-tank rifles were not very effective against the forehead of Panthers or Tigers, but at close range, on the sides, they could work wonders. Soldiers with bazookas like shadows crept along the outskirts of the forest, waiting for the moment for a deadly blow. Still, the price was terrifying. Each explosion shook the ground. Each new damaged Sherman reminded everyone how fragile their steel defenses were. The line of defense bent, buckled in places under pressure. But by the middle of the morning, something amazing began to appear through the smoke and rumble. It wasn't another Malmedy. It was not an easy massacre for the SS. The Americans fought back with fury, ingenuity, and a simple refusal to die. The German onslaught, which had seemed unstoppable from the start, began to lose momentum. Patton's soldiers did not break down. They withstood the first, most terrible onslaught. But the day was just beginning. Part 4. The Art of Survival. Improvisation and Resilience. By noon, the battle had turned into an exhausting showdown of attrition. The SS men, irritated and surprised by the fierce resistance, resumed their attacks over and over again with methodical, almost maniacal determination. The American lines bent like a steel spring, cracked at the seams in places but did not break. Smoke from burning diesel fuel, exploded shells, and burning foliage covered the forest with an acrid pall. The air was thick with the smell of sulfur, burning rubber, and blood. It was at this moment, in the crucible of battle, that moments of tactical genius began to be born, which determined the outcome of the day. Sergeant Wilson's armored hedgehog, Sergeant Thomas Tank Wilson, commander of the Sherman, saw his comrades turn into flaming coffins one by one. His own car was hit in the undercarriage. The track was severed, and the tank lost its mobility. For many, this would mean ordering the crew to abandon the vehicle and retreat as infantry. But Wilson saw something else. The turret of his tank was not damaged. The gun is loaded. The crew was alive. He made a bold decision. By radio, he contacted the other surviving tanks. Damaged cars form a circle, running gear, maneuver around them, creating a fulcrum. Thus was born an improvised tactic, later called the armored hedgehog. The motionless but still combat-ready Shermans turned into stationary firing points. Mobile tanks cruised around them, covering them with their hulls, diverting fire on themselves, suppressing the infantry. It was primitive, desperate, but incredibly effective. When the next wave of German Panthers tried to break through, they ran into concentrated, multi-layered fire. The Panther, which was trying to outflank, was hit simultaneously from two directions. The Royal Tiger, slow and invulnerable from the front, was forced to stop when artillery fire from an observation post showered it with shrapnel and mud, blinding and demoralizing the crew. Wilson's gamble bought valuable time, but the innovation didn't end there. Martinez's ears. Among the Americans was Private First Class Roberto Martinez, a young radio operator born in Mexico City. He came to the United States just a few years before the war in search of a better life. Now, in the heart of Germany, he was fighting for the country he considered his home. In between the attacks, listening to the broadcast on his SCR 300 walkie-talkie, he caught a pattern. The German attacks had a certain rhythm. Concentration, a short pause to regroup, and then a new charge. Martinez, who had been a radio technician before the war and knew basic German, offered Captain Morrison a bold idea. What if they tried to intercept German communications? If they can eavesdrop on the enemy's commands, they can anticipate his next move. The risk was huge. Direction finding, disclosure of their frequencies. But desperation required bold decisions. Using captured German equipment and his own knowledge, Martinez set up an improvised interception post in a ruined farmhouse. He tuned the receivers, filtered out the interference, listened to the hoarse voices of the German officers. And it worked. Within a few hours, his work began to change the picture of the battle. For the first time, Captain Morrison and his men weren't just reacting, they were anticipating. When the German tanks were just beginning to concentrate for a new attack in a certain sector, the American artillery was already transferring its fire there, scattering them even before the attack began. When the SS Grenadiers tried to move stealthily for a flank attack, bazookas and machine gun nests were already waiting for them. The German commanders were furious. Their doctrine, their belief in their own superiority, faced something inexplicable. It seemed to them that Americans were just incredibly lucky. They did not realize that they were faced with the flexibility of thinking, with the ability to learn and adapt in real time, a quality that the rigid, hierarchical, and ideologized structure of the SS was unable to reproduce. Part 5. Climax and Silence. The Price of Disobedience. The climax came in the evening. Enraged and drained of blood by the protracted battles, the Leibstandarte commanders decided to deliver a crushing final blow. They threw everything they had left into the fight. The Panthers moved forward in a linear formation, firing a hurricane of fire on the move. The infantry marched in thick chains to storm the ridge, regardless of losses. Artillery and mortars launched a barrage, trying to wipe out the last pockets of resistance. It was the moment of truth. It seemed like the crest was about to fall under that steel roller, but the Americans held on. Wilson's armored hedgehog was spewing steel and fire. Martinez's radios crackled with the latest intercepted orders, allowing the gunners to get ahead of the curve. Everyone, from the machine gunner changing the red-hot barrel to the orderly bandaging wounds under fire, everyone became part of a single resistance organism. The crest of the hill turned into a continuous glow from muzzle flash, flashes of shots. The earth itself seemed to be on fire. In this hell, the SS faced not panic, but cold, fierce determination. The attack faltered. German tanks, damaged and set on fire, were frozen on the slopes. The infantry, having suffered terrible losses, lay down. When the fighting finally subsided, Deafening silence reigned on the battlefield, broken only by the crackle of burning equipment and the groans of the wounded. The 1st SS Panzer Division, which had begun the day confident of an easy victory, was retreating, leaving behind a steaming graveyard of its own equipment. They left 17 damaged and abandoned tanks on the battlefield, including several formidable Panthers and 1 Royal Tiger, and more than 200 dead and wounded. But the price paid by the Americans was terrifying. Captain Morrison's forces lost up to 60% of their personnel. The ridge was littered with the bodies of the fallen and the charred wrecks of the Shermans. Paramedics worked by the light of pocket flashlights, pulling the wounded out of the torn-up ground. There was no rejoicing among the survivors, just overwhelming weariness and emptiness. They were expecting death, and many had already mentally said goodbye to life. Now they had to live with the memory of what they had seen and done. And even in this hell, the difference between the two armies was revealed. American medics risking their lives provided assistance not only to their own, but also to the wounded SS men, dragging them to shelters, sharing scarce supplies of bandages and water. Many Germans, brought up in a fanatical ideology, refused help in disgust, preferring to die rather than accept it from those who were considered entrenched. Part 6. An Echo in History. The Legacy of Stadt Kiel. The tactical significance of the battle at Stadt Kiel was local. Germany was doomed, and this battle could not change the course of the war. But its psychological and operational significance was enormous. The myth has been dispelled. The aura of invincibility of the Leibstandarte was irrevocably destroyed. From that day on, every Allied soldier knew that the SS elite could not only be stopped, but also defeated. They can be outmaneuvered, outsmarted, and forced to retreat. This knowledge was as important as the new division at the front. Tactical legacy. The improvised tactics born out of that battle became the property of the entire army. Sergeant Wilson's armored hedgehog began to be studied as a method of defense in conditions of overwhelming superiority of the enemy in armor. Martinez's work on intercepting tactical communications proved the vital importance of radio intelligence on the battlefield and stimulated the development of these units.